Dear colleagues, good morning, good afternoon, or good evening to who has joined us online or will later watch this video. Welcome to a new virtual event that will discuss how to ensure a resilient global biodiversity framework to disaster and climate risks. Our event today is co-convened by the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction, or PEDRR, the Friends of Ecosystem-based Adaptation, or FEBA, and the Geneva Environment Network. This session aims at drawing attention to the importance of integrating resilience in the global biodiversity framework for greater alignment with the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, the Paris Agreement, and the new Glasgow Pact, prior to the final face-to-face negotiations of the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework. Indeed, in March this year, the parties to the Convention on Biological Diversity should meet to negotiate the text of the new Global Biodiversity Framework in Geneva, if the ongoing pandemic allows. This is one of the motivations for hosting today's event, in order to prepare the delegations and other stakeholders in Geneva and beyond, who might be directly or indirectly involved with these negotiations. Before we start, let me remind you that the documents presented, the summary, as well as the video of this discussion will be made available on the webpage of this event. We will share the link in the chat. Throughout the event, you can raise your questions by using the Q&A box. We will answer these in the Q&A session. The moderator of our session is Nathalie Doswal, coordinator of the PEDRR Secretariat. She will take over after the first opening remarks. It is now my pleasure to introduce Marisol Estrella, who is coordinating the United Nations Environment Programme activities on disaster risk reduction, and she will deliver opening remarks on behalf of PEDRR. Marisol, over to you.
Thank you very much. It is indeed my privilege to be part of this discussion. My name is Marisol Estrella, again with the UN Environment Programme. I would like to thank very much our organizers, most especially the Geneva Environment Network, and Diana for bringing us all together here at this event. So good afternoon and good evening or good morning to all of you that have called in. I am here today not just as a representative of UNEP, but also representing the Partnership for Environment and Disaster Risk Reduction, or PEDRR. We were established in 2008. We are currently 28 organizations that hail from the conservation, disaster risk reduction, humanitarian, and climate communities. We bring together our collective expertise where we have been working side by side with member states and local communities to apply what we call ecosystem-based approaches, or also known as nature-based solutions for increasing disaster and climate resilience. PEDRR is one of the most long-standing partnerships on this topic, and we are really proud to count the CBD Secretariat and its members as one of our PEDRR members. So this event comes at an important crossroads as our global community faces what we call a triple global emergency. These are climate change and its impacts on increased disasters and extreme weather events, the biodiversity loss, which has been unprecedented, and the COVID-19 pandemic. These three global emergencies are linked through the ways in which we choose to manage or mismanage nature. About 90% of global disasters are now linked to water and climate-related events, and these have affected over 50 million people just in 2020 alone. With climate change, extreme weather events are even more amplified, up to 5 times more now than in the last 50 years. Climate change and disaster events can have significant impacts on ecosystems and biodiversity. I've seen this firsthand myself, for example, in Jamaica, where Hurricane Ivan in 2004 severely damaged already degraded coral reef systems. And the reef systems really have never been able to recover, as each year there are storms which have kept them from recovering over the long term. And this has undermined the local fishery sector in the west coast of Jamaica. So there's definitely significant impacts on biodiversity as a result of increased weather events. So biodiversity, while they have faced many disasters over millennia. Today, with the changing climates and the unprecedented loss of biodiversity and high levels of land degradation, means that endangered species and critical habitats are less resilient to disasters, having less chances of survival and recovery. It is therefore critical that measures be put in place to ensure increased biodiversity resilience to disasters and climate change. What we do know is that biodiversity and ecosystem degradation are a major driver of disaster risk. For instance, reduced forest cover contributes to flooding, erosion, and landslides. Initial studies have also shown that outbreaks such as the COVID-19 pandemic are linked to wildlife habitat encroachments. But the good news is that the reverse is true. If we invest in healthy, well-managed ecosystems and their underlying biodiversity, they provide critical services which make nature and people much more resilient. We rely on ecosystems for food, for water, for fueling our economies, but also for providing natural buffers. For example, healthy reef systems can reduce storm surge wave impacts on our shorelines. Here in Switzerland, where I am based, protection forests are carefully managed in order to mitigate risks of avalanche, landslides, and rockfalls, thus protecting villagers and important economic assets. In other words, working with nature, protecting biodiversity, managing ecosystems sustainably are at the core of people's well-being and resilience. So over the last 15 years, member states and our global communities have actually come to an increasing realization and agreement that nature is key to enhancing our resilience. So our global agendas are much more closely aligned than ever before. In 2015, the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction specifically recognized the role of biodiversity and ecosystem-based approaches for reducing disaster and climate risks. Parties of the CBD have also echoed similar messages through its adoption of multiple decisions, particularly in COP12 in 2014, which advocated for joint efforts in biodiversity, climate change, and disaster risk reduction. So similar actions have been taken by parties of the Ramsar Convention, UNCCD, and other biodiversity-related conventions. So all of these policy agreements did not happen by chance. It required working collectively in partnerships and bringing together our conservation, disaster risk reduction, and climate communities and our shared goals. So while this year parties of the CBD will agree on the new Global Biodiversity Framework, it will be important to build on this historical cooperation and achievements already made by member states. It is crucial to build in resilience into the new Global Biodiversity Framework if we are to look towards a future of living in harmony with nature. So I hope that today's event brings attention once again to these important efforts of promoting ecosystem-based or nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, climate change mitigation, and adaptation, and bringing together our shared goals. And I very much look forward to hearing our panelists and also thoughts and comments from the participants on our platform. So I wish all of us a good event ahead. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marisol, for these opening remarks. I would like to now introduce Sonia Peña Moreno, who is the director of the International Policy Center at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So, Sonia, I would like to invite you to also provide some opening remarks.
Many thanks, Natalie, and welcome everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. One of the first events, I guess, from the year, and on a very relevant agenda. So before a few points, let me first introduce FEBA. For those of you that don't know it, Friends of EBA is a global collaborative network of 90 plus agencies and organizations involved in ecosystem-based adaptation, working jointly to share experiences and knowledge to improve the implementation of EBA on the ground and have a stronger and more strategic learning and policy influence on EVA. So FEBA partners, of which IUCN is one, work together to promote EBA integration into the implementation of the Paris Agreement and raise awareness and understanding of EBA in adaptation planning processes and multilateral policy frameworks. So in the CBD, or the CBD actually, recognized through Decision 14/5 in Egypt, FEBA as a partner, as a key partner to support parties in their efforts to promote ecosystem-based approaches to climate change adaptation. So as you know, and it was mentioned already, currently the parties to the CBD are negotiating this Global Biodiversity Framework for this decade and beyond. So this framework aims to halt the loss of biodiversity and ensure the vision of a world of living in harmony with nature by 2050. But unfortunately, I think that due to the pandemic and the many delays in the process, negotiations have become a bit slow-paced, and meetings have been turned into virtual gatherings and discussions to try and shape and work on the structure of this global framework, its global goals and targets. But for many, what has happened so far is not enough. So the current text of the Global Biodiversity Framework is very complex. It's difficult to see clearly a line of sight. So where are we now? Where do we want to go to? And through which concrete actions do we want to get there? So as Diana mentioned at the introduction, face-to-face meetings or resume meetings of the CBD are now scheduled to take place here in Geneva in March. And this provides a very good opportunity to input into the process and shape that framework in a way that turns it into being fit for purpose. So allow me a couple of words about the Global Biodiversity Framework. IUCN in particular is of the view that it must be a truly global framework and a unified action plan that actually integrates not only the objectives of the CBD, but of the other two Rio conventions, the other biodiversity-related conventions, and other processes such as the Sendai Framework for disaster risk reduction. And in thus doing, ensures that there is full alignment with the Sustainable Development Goals that all countries of this world are trying to also implement. It wouldn't make sense otherwise. And this synergistic approach is not only desired, but I think is a precondition for a successful global biodiversity framework. And here I must emphasize that the interlinkages across all of these interconnected processes and issues can be further enhanced and improved through the application at scale of nature-based solutions. My colleague Sandeep will speak a bit more about nature-based solutions, so I won't delve into this too much, but allow me just to highlight that NBS can address societal challenges, enhance human well-being, support the aims of a wide variety of policies, including those that relate to human health, climate change, disaster risk reduction, combating desertification, etc., while at the same time enhancing biodiversity and ecosystem functions. So we thus want to see the text and the reference of the Global Biodiversity Framework including NBS fully in at least one of the targets that are being discussed. So what do we want to see ultimately adopted in Kunming whenever we get there, hopefully this year in China, and implemented actually throughout the decade and beyond? We want to see an ambitious yet simple, science-based, a global plan to drive action by all parts of society to conserve biodiversity and indeed our livelihoods and people's resilience. A framework that reflects the urgency of transforming our societies, the way we produce, we consume, and to maintain and secure the planet's life support system, thus getting us to ensuring a so-called nature positive world. I'm going to leave it there and look forward to our discussions today and a great event. Thank you so much.
Great. Thank you very much, Sonia, for your opening remarks. We're going to be moving now to a panel discussion to also bring to life through different views some of these points that both you and Marisol have illustrated today. We will be first moving to speak about work ongoing in Japan, after which we will be showing you a case study video from Colombia, and moving to seeing some views about the Sendai Framework and biodiversity presented by UNDRR, and finally we will have further words on the synergistics between like the UNFCCC, the Paris Framework, and nature-based solutions. So without further ado, I would like to invite the first panelist, which is Mr. Takashi Mizushina, who is the first secretary of the Permanent Mission of Japan to the international organizations in Geneva. So welcome. Thank you very much for joining, and the floor is yours.
Thank you for introducing Ms. Doswald, and good afternoon and good evening and good morning for participation. Thank you for inviting for participation. I'm Takashi Mizushina from Japan Mission in Geneva. So I would like to explain the background of the increased emphasis on eco-DRR in Japan. The experience of the Great East Japan earthquake in 2011 brought major changes to society in Japan, even for the context for disaster risk reduction. So it made us aware of the need for comprehensive disaster risk reduction strategies in preparation for disasters that surpass our worst case scenarios. These circumstances have led to an increased awareness of the importance of the ecosystem-based approaches. In Japan, eco-DRR is not a new concept, but a traditional approach. Japan has a long tradition of conserving and making use of local ecosystems to reduce disaster risk. For example, rice terraces for mitigation of floods, homestead woodland for windbreak, and coastal forest for preventing high tides. Therefore, we feel a strong affinity for eco-DRR. Yes, thank you. So I'd like to introduce cases on institutional framework and the latest findings related to eco-DRR in Japan. So please look at the wetlands, disaster risk reduction by wetlands. So this slide shows two Ramsar sites that are contributing to disaster risk reduction. One is Watarase Yusuichi River Basin. The place is near from Tokyo. In the typhoon disaster of 2019, the four regulating reservoirs, including Watarase Yusuichi detention basin, stored a large amount of flood water, the largest ever, and contributed to preventing flood damage in the Tokyo metropolitan area. The other is Kushiro Shitsugen wetland, the largest wetland in Japan. In the study that simulated past heavy rainfall with the case of current state of the wetlands, and with the case of partial loss of wetlands. The water retention function of Kushiro-Shitsugen wetland was assessed to have contributed to a reduction of peak flow and delaying the arrival of peak flow. I believe that this knowledge will be important driving force to promote eco-DRR. Yes, thank you very much. Finally, I'd like to highlight two efforts by the Ministry of Environment Japan to promote the implementation of eco-DRR on the ground. The first one is the development of a handbook on eco-DRR, the right side slide. This handbook introduces the basic concepts of eco-DRR and summarizes its advantages and challenges. In addition, a brochure introducing specific examples of eco-DRR have been prepared. These materials have been introduced mainly to practitioners in local governments. The second one is effort to create a potential map showing the function of ecosystems. In order to support the implementation of eco-DRR in river basins, we are investigating how to create maps that visualize areas suited for eco-DRR by assessing and overlaying the habitat function of wetland and flood hazards. We aim to lead the disaster resilient community planning in harmony with nature and river basin for this effort. We believe that multi-level and cross-sectional stakeholder involvement and consensus building is necessary to promote eco-DRR in the field. So to achieve this, I believe it is important to present version of society with harmony with nature by the government and promote efforts based on latest scientific knowledge and needs of local stakeholders. So I'd like to express the keywords as Japan has a traditional approach of eco-DRR, so we would like to contribute by hazard maps and handbooks. So we would like to continue our efforts based on these perspectives. Thank you for listening. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mitsushina. It's really interesting to hear about Japan's work on eco-DRR and how wetlands, which are some of the very important ecosystems that are disappearing fast today, and how important these sites are for disaster risk reduction. And also, you have a wealth of knowledge from your traditional approach. So thank you very much. And just reminding everyone, if you have any questions, to put it in the Q&A box, and we'll come to that towards the end of today. So now I'd like to present a case study from Colombia. So Colombia couldn't actually join today, but suggested we could use this case study, which shows their efforts working with also eco-DRR to reduce landslides. And so that's also another approach that they have been now taking in the country. They have an eco-DRR roadmap as well. So if we could now play the case study, you'll get but also a sense of work ongoing in Colombia. Thank you.
Colombia is a country where natural, socioeconomic and political factors converge, causing disasters to have a daily impact on different regions of the country. an analysis of disaster risk in Colombia reveals that 31% of the population is at risk due to various types of landslides. There is a significant correlation between the quantity and dynamics of water resources and landslides, so working at the watershed is fundamental to disaster risk reduction. The Guarino River Basin experience is a good example. This basin is located between the eastern part of the department of Caldas and the northern part of the department of Tolima. The traditional fishing activity in its downstream area, its potential for hydroelectric generation in the midstream and upstream areas, and the great variety of farming systems, mostly coffee and livestock, are some of the benefits brought by the Guarino River. However, there are also different environmental conflicts in the basin, generating concerns for both communities and public institutions. The basin planning process started in 2008, and an immediate action plan was created through participation of local stakeholders. Disaster risk reduction projects were formulated in each area and made possible thanks to the creation of a core group and the signing of agreements between Isagen, Cortolima and Corpo Caldas. The projects involve ecosystem restoration to control soil degradation processes and promote land use changes towards sustainable production systems, with a plan that encourages community engagement. They integrate the use of biomechanical structures with the high-density planting of protective and stabilizing vegetation and, in some cases, with civil engineering works. This way, vegetation becomes the main factor in reducing landslide risk in these locations. Plants provided through community nurseries encourage the direct involvement of the communities. The project findings include understanding the complexities of environmental situations, their extent and physical, biotic and cultural diversity, the importance of interinstitutional, interdisciplinary and collaborative work, understanding interconnectivity between actions, the importance of community engagement and its connection within the processes, generating employment and building local capacities, the need for continuity and sustainability, as well as other key knowledge concepts.
Great, thank you very much. I hope you found that interesting. If you wanted more information also on this case study, there is actually also more available through our massive open online course on nature-based solutions for disaster and climate resilience. So that's something also if you'd like further information on this case study and others. Now, moving back to the panel discussion, I'd like to now introduce Hugh Bainan, who is the Deputy Chief of the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction, New York Liaison Office, which is working to advance policy coherence between disaster risk reduction, climate change, action, and sustainable development through intergovernmental decisions and interagency processes in New York. So welcome, Hugh, and thank you very much for joining. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Natalie, and good morning, colleagues from New York. I hope everybody is safe and well. I'd really like to thank the organizers and PEDRR for inviting UNDRR to be part of this important event this morning in New York. As mentioned, my name is Hugh Bainan, and I work in a small team here in New York with UNDRR that works with member states and UN system colleagues and civil society partners to promote the integration of disaster risk reduction into governmental policy decisions. So it's really a pleasure to join you today to give our perspective on the importance of policy coherence between the Sendai Framework for DRR and the new Global Biodiversity Framework. I think it's been mentioned already, definitely by the introductory remarks from Marisol. I think what we're talking about today is shared goals across DRR, environment, and climate change community to make best use of our resources to increase the level of impact on the ground. That also really relies on the level of policy coherence at the governmental level. So COVID-19 pandemic and the climate emergency and the biodiversity crisis really demonstrate the complex and increasingly systemic nature of risk. They show how disaster impacts interconnect and cascade through systems. They've really exposed entrenched weaknesses within our economic, social, and environmental systems. And as the environment interacts with everything that we do, systemic risk can only be reduced by working with rather than against nature. So this is why at UNDRR, we advocate strongly for a comprehensive approach to risk management that includes ecosystem and nature-based. The states have really already agreed on the importance of nature-based solutions for disaster risk reduction, as well as the value of risk reduction practices for ecosystem protection. And several intergovernmental agreements and declarations already give clear policy guidance in this area. Of course, most notably the Sendai Framework for protection, and the framework recognizes the unsustainable use of natural resources, poor land management, and declining ecosystems are underlying drivers of disaster. Sendai Framework urges all countries to strengthen the sustainable use and management of ecosystems to build resilience to disaster. To support this approach, the framework recognizes the need for greater collaboration between global and regional mechanisms for DRR, biodiversity, and the environment. And this policy guidance really has been picked up here in New York in several ways. First, I'd highlight the General Assembly in its annual second Convention on disaster risk reduction. The resolution really affirms a strong commitment to coordination and coherence between the implementation of the Sendai Framework and the Convention on Biological Diversity. Its resolution, the Assembly calls for all countries to translate this integration between global policy frameworks into national laws, policies, and regulations. And the value of nature-based solutions also featured prominently at the regional platform for disaster risk reduction. These platforms convened every 2 to 3 years. And in November 2021, they were hosted by the governments of Jamaica, Kenya, Morocco, and Portugal, as well as the UNDRR. And the platforms really give guidance at the regional level how to implement the Sendai. So last year, through the political declarations and the action plans that came out of the regional platform, countries agreed that risk-informed development requires greater coherence across policies and activities for disaster risk reduction, climate change adaptation, and biodiversity conservation. There's also a clear need for scaling up investments in nature-based solutions for DRR. So my point is, there is really a strong foundation for intergovernmental policy guidance that calls for coherence between the Sendai Framework and the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So while the Kunming Declaration recognizes that interrelated crises pose risks to people and planet, and also recognizes that ecosystem-based approaches can boost resilience, it does not go so far as to call for a risk-informed approach to the new Global Biodiversity Framework. And while we know there is clear evidence that biodiversity conservation and DRR are mutually reinforcing, and this needs to be reflected in the new framework. With that in mind, I'd like to highlight maybe a few bottlenecks that prevent policy coherence in policy setting at national and local level. Maybe could be addressed in the new framework. First is around a lack of coherence in data collection and analysis. Most risk assessments conducted by the DRR community don't usually take environmental considerations into account. Conversely, environmental assessments often don't include risk assessments. The ecological impact assessments should be incorporated into disaster risk assessments, especially at the local level. This requires capacity development in both camps. This needs to be supported by greater resource allocation and transfer of technology for risk analytics. Second is on risk governance and governance and coordination mechanisms that are not often conducive for coherence. So ecosystem-based approaches should be incorporated into strengthened risk governance mechanisms from the local level all the way to the transboundary level. And one clear way to do this is to integrate nature-based solutions into national and local DRR strategies. This can support an approach to risk-informed public policy in all areas, that capitalizes on nature-based solutions. However, in many countries, there's limited coordination among ministries and institutions, and you have monitoring systems, financing systems that are currently barriers to this level of integration. That's something I think that needs to be overcome in the next framework. And this needs advocacy, I think, to raise awareness among policymakers on the potential of nature-based solutions. So third and most importantly is financing, maybe arguably most importantly, but financing is critical. And we know already that for every $100 allocated for disaster financing, only 50 cents goes to risk reduction and prevention. The rest is allocated to preparedness and response. So this imbalance in financing is really unsustainable. And one clear way to increase investment in nature-based solutions for DRR would be through infrastructure. And this was recognized in the Global Platform 2019, and the chair's summary calls on countries to capitalize on the co-benefits of ecosystem-based approaches and to leverage complementarity across blue, green, and grey infrastructure. But to support this approach, one idea could be to include nature-based solutions within principles and standards for resilience within infrastructure. Both green and grey infrastructure can also be included in pipelines of investor-ready projects that are developed by countries to be financed by IFIs, development banks, and the private sector. In closing, allow me to highlight the midterm review of the Sendai Framework. This midterm review is mandated by the General Assembly. It's an opportunity for countries to take stock of progress in implementing the Sendai Framework over the first 7 years. It will culminate in a high-level meeting at the GA in May 2023, and a political declaration should renew commitment to risk-informed development and provide further policy guidance to increase the pace of implementation. And the Secretary General has already called for the Conference of Parties on the Convention of Biological Diversity to consider including DRR in its work. So a strong focus on nature-based solutions in the midterm review can provide valuable input to the work of the Convention and promote the application of DRR in the implementation of the new Global Biodiversity Framework. And lastly, with the release of the SG's report on our common agenda that came out late last year, risk reduction and strategic foresight really is at the forefront of the international community's agenda today. But to preserve biological diversity for the benefit of current and future generations, it's really critical that the new Global Biodiversity Framework adopt an approach that reduces risk and builds resilience against future shocks and hazards. With that, I will leave it there and look forward to questions. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much for that really informative also discussion, thinking through some of those bottlenecks, thinking about assessments, risk governance and financing, and that important call to a risk-informed approach in the Global Biodiversity Framework. So yes, once again, any questions, please post within the Q&A. And now, last but not least, for our panel discussion, I would like to introduce Sandeep Sengupta, who is the Global Coordinator for Climate Change at the International Union for the Conservation of Nature. So Sandeep, thank you very much for joining us today, and the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Natalie. And let me also take this opportunity to express my thanks to PEDRR and FEBA and the Geneva Environment Network for organizing today's very important webinar. We've already heard from previous speakers the need for developing synergies across the different international policy processes and the interconnected nature of ecosystems and the contribution that they can make in addressing different challenges. What I wanted to do in my presentation is to actually share the experiences of how nature and ecosystems and nature-based solutions, etc., have been incorporated within the global climate regime. Next slide, please. So historically, it's important to note that there has been a strong recognition of the importance of ecosystems within the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement. So if we rewind the clock back to 1992 and the adoption of the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, what is quite remarkable is that even in the objective of the UNFCCC Convention text itself, there is a clear call for the stabilization of greenhouse gas concentrations in the atmosphere within a time frame that is sufficient to allow ecosystems to adapt naturally. And even more remarkable is Article 4.1d, which is part of the general commitments that are applicable to all parties to the convention, which call on all parties to promote the conservation and enhancement of greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs, including, and the ecosystems that are included in the text are highlighted as you can see on the slide. So the full range of ecosystems is actually recognized within the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change itself. And if we then fast forward to the Paris Agreement in 2015, this recognition has continued to be highlighted. So for example, the preamble of the Paris Agreement notes the importance of ensuring the integrity of all ecosystems, including that of oceans, and the protection of biodiversity. It also continues to reiterate the importance of the conservation and enhancement of all the greenhouse gas sinks and reservoirs that are referred to in Article 4.1d of the Convention. And there are strong references to the contribution that ecosystems can play in core parts of the Paris Agreement itself. So if we, just to take one example, think of Article 4, the article that calls for meeting the 2 degree, 1.5 degree temperature goal through a rapid reduction of emissions to be achieved through a balance between emissions by source and removals by sinks in the second half of the century. The removals of sinks constitutes, what we would refer to the role of nature and nature-based solutions. And likewise, in the Paris Agreement, there are dedicated references in Article 5 in relation to the role of forests in REDD+, in Article 7 to the contribution that ecosystems can make in building resilience and adaptation, and indeed in Article 8 to the role of ecosystems in helping to reduce loss and damage. Next slide, please. More recently, what we have noticed in the last couple of years or so is this growing convergences, as previous speakers have also highlighted, of the biodiversity and climate agendas, and particularly, depicted through the framing of nature-based solutions. I think perhaps the most prominent example recently of this is the 2019 Climate Action Summit in New York that was convened by the UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres, which indeed included for the first time a dedicated track on nature-based solutions that was co-chaired by China and New Zealand, and which resulted in a nature-based solutions for climate manifesto. And this recognition of nature-based solutions has been subsequently reiterated as well in the Leaders' Pledge for Nature in October 2020 in the UN General Assembly. More recently, last year, in the recognition of both nature-based solutions and ecosystem-based approaches have been explicitly referenced both in the ministerial communiques of the G7 and the G20 summits. Last September, of course, we had the IUCN World Conservation Congress in Marseille, and a clear message that came out from our members was recognizing very clearly this interlinked nature of the biodiversity and climate crisis that the world is facing today, alongside the COVID crisis, of course, but also the critical role that nature-based solutions could play in addressing the climate challenge. And indeed, these were the messages that were communicated from our community, from the conservation community through the IUCN Congress, through to COP21 in Glasgow in November last year, which also had a dedicated thematic prioritization of nature and nature-based solutions. A couple of other points also worth noting is that increasingly countries have begun to incorporate nature-based solutions within their national climate strategies and plans, and explicitly within their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So the one that I've highlighted here is the Chile's updated NDC, which explicitly recognizes the contribution of nature-based solutions. Last year, there was also the release of the IPBES IPCC joint workshop report on biodiversity and climate change, which also incorporated and referenced nature-based solutions. Next slide, please. So at this point, it's probably useful to remind the audience, especially those who may not be familiar with the term of what nature-based solutions are. What you see on the screen is the definition, is the IUCN definition of nature-based solutions. So defined as actions to protect, sustainably manage and restore natural or modified ecosystems that address societal challenges. And my colleague Sonia already referred to a whole suite of societal challenges that nature-based solutions could address. but the intention is that these are addressed in an effective and adaptive manner, and importantly, simultaneously provides benefits for both human well-being and biodiversity. And this was the definition that was adopted by IUCN's 1,400 plus members. So our 90 states, our 120 government agency, and our over 1,000 non-governmental and indigenous peoples organizations members at the 2016 IUCN World Conservation in Hawaii. This represents the most widely used definition globally to date. Importantly, it is important to underscore that nature-based solutions is an umbrella term, but it is very deeply and concretely rooted in the ecosystem approach of the CBD. As I previously already said, it's been cited by IPBES and IPCC in their joint report last year, but it's also been cited in over 2,000 peer-reviewed publications in recent years. And more recently, in 2020, IUCN launched the IUCN Global Standard for Nature-Based Solutions to help adjudicate between what is and what isn't a nature-based solutions in its application through the identification of 8 specific criteria and 28 indicators to help operationalize this concept further. So in the images on the slide, you can see a sort of the application of nature-based solutions in a wide range of different settings. Next slide, please. So this slide is perhaps just to underscore that the distinction between nature-based solutions is what we considered as rooted in ecosystems, as differentiated from nature-derived solutions and nature-inspired solutions. So nature-based solutions being corely located in the role and contribution of healthy ecosystems through their conservation, management, and restoration. They're often described as no-regret options that can provide benefits to people in a wide range of scenarios. And in the climate context, nature-based solutions have been widely acknowledged as playing an important role in addressing both the causes, but also the consequences of climate change. So if one were just to put it in a pithy equation, you could think of nature-based solutions to climate change being ecosystem-based mitigation plus ecosystem-based adaptation plus ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction. Next slide, please. So just to quickly unpack in my following 2 slides, some of the benefits of investing in nature-based solutions. And this slide focuses on the mitigation benefits. This was from a paper that was published in Nature last year, which identified that which estimated that nature-based solutions could save around 10 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year. So that's equivalent to the total transportation emissions globally, worldwide. Of which 4 gigatons could come from the protection of ecosystems, 4 from the sustainable management of working lands, and 2 from the restoration of degraded ecosystems. And if you look at the graph on the right-hand side of this slide, you can actually see the difference that investing in nature-based solutions in an ambitious manner in a way that is designed for longevity, the impact that it can have in terms of reducing the temperature rise, whether we look at it from a 2-degree trajectory or a 1.5-degree trajectory. Next slide, please. So a couple of months back in Glasgow, together with our colleagues in UNEP, IUCN also launched this report on nature-based solutions for climate change mitigation that actually reviewed not only the previous study, but a range of other peer-reviewed assessments that have tried to estimate the potential of nature-based solutions in terms of its carbon sequestration and storage benefits. And the highlight from this study was that nature-based solutions are absolutely critical for achieving the net zero goal of the Paris Agreement. It is also important to highlight that the net zero goal by 2050 can be achieved not just by nature-based solutions. So nature-based solutions are not a substitute for the deep decarbonization that is required of the global economy. So it's rather ambitious emission reductions plus nature-based solutions through the protection, management, and conservation of restoration of ecosystems. And what this study showed is that at a conservative basis, nature-based solutions could deliver at least 5 gigatons of CO2 emission reductions by 2030 and at least 10 gigatons per year by 2050. Next slide, please. Now, this slide, more pertinent to the focus of today's conversation, is highlights the importance of nature-based solutions from an adaptation and a disaster risk reduction point of view. And we, most of us are familiar with the role that mangroves in particular play in building coastal resilience. So over $65 billion in flood protection and safeguarding 15 million people against flooding each year, alongside storing carbon. But also importantly, the role of ecosystems in helping to build urban resilience, whether it's in terms of absorbing stormwater runoff or reducing the urban heat island effect or reducing drought impacts, are all also being increasingly seen in urban context. And just one, we heard from our colleague in Japan, the role of nature-based solutions in reducing disasters and helping to reduce disaster risks. And this is just another example of wetlands that helped to avoid over $600 million in direct flood damages during Hurricane Sandy in the US in 2012. Next slide, please. So as a consequence of a recognition of the contribution of nature-based solutions, both from a mitigation and an adaptation and disaster risk reduction perspective, increasingly what we find are countries at the national level incorporating nature-based solutions within their nationally determined contributions under the Paris Agreement. So in 2019, IUCN, together with Oxford University, prepared this report, which identified that around 66% of Paris Agreement signatories had incorporated nature-based solutions within their NDCs in one form or the other. But what we found is that many of these were still pretty general references and that they needed to be made much more concrete and quantitative and robust down the line. And the graph that you see on the right-hand side is a more recent depiction of how nature-based solutions have been incorporated in over 100 NDCs as we assessed in the joint UNEP IUCN report across different regions. And the next slide, which is my final slide. So what happened in Glasgow? Now, clearly, one of the remarkable factors about COP26 was the absolutely unprecedented attention that was given to nature and nature-based solutions at COP26. It was almost, as some people said, like a nature COP rather than a climate COP. So as I mentioned earlier, nature and nature-based solutions was one of the 5 thematic priorities of the UK COP26 presidency going into Glasgow. But in Glasgow itself, there were multiple high-level events and references to nature-based solutions. For example, in the statements made by heads of state and government and ministers in the high-level segment, including in the World Leaders Summit, there were also a range of announcements, including announcements, of billions of dollars in financing. I think the one that I wanted to highlight was this joint nature statement that was issued by all the multilateral development banks that committed to supporting countries to implement nature-based solutions in their national plans and strategies. And what's really interesting, if you read that text, is that it calls for committing to support the countries in integrating nature-based solutions, not only within their NDCs, their long-term strategies and national adaptation plans, but also in their NBSAPs under the CBD and their land degradation neutrality targets under the UNCCD. What was also remarkable, if you look at the formal outcomes of Glasgow and what came out of the Glasgow Climate Pact, so the cover decisions, Decision 1 CP26 under the Convention and Decision 1 CMA3 under the Paris Agreement, was the explicit recognition for the very first time, number one, of the interlinked global crisis of climate change and biodiversity loss, and number two, of the critical role of protecting, conserving, and restoring nature and ecosystems in delivering benefits for both adaptation and mitigation. And you can see that the reference that was used in the Glasgow text was this general reference of nature and ecosystems. But what we in IUCN feel is that there is now an important need to move from recognition to actually establishing more concrete pathways for delivery. And in our view, nature-based solutions provides a widely accepted operational framework that can help not only the UNFCCC, but also the other Rio conventions, and in the context of the CBD, the Post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework process as well. And a clearer reference to nature-based solutions will give greater confidence, in our view, to the many state and non-state actors who who are already applying them presently at scale. So, as someone said, NBS has escaped the lab. It's out there everywhere. Countries, non-state actors are doing it. But what referencing in international policy processes would do is that it would help provide greater accountability and oversight of NBS directly by the parties themselves. So I'll just leave it at that, and thank you very much once again.
Great. Thank you very much, Sandeep, for this comprehensive overview of the increasing commitment, especially in the UNFCCC policy sector for nature-based solutions, but also, as you said, the need for some better policy ownership of the term. So I'd like to now move. We have a few questions that we've received. Thank you very much. If you have any others, don't hesitate to put them in the Q&A box. I think the first question I'd like to quickly address is from Enrico Mezzacapo. He was asking about the Colombian case study and would like to know more about the main barriers and challenges, something that cannot answer here today. However, I can answer. He also asked about whether the project included policy support and collaboration. And I can say that yes, at the government level, at the national government level, eco-DRR is part of the disaster risk reduction plan. So it has got strong policy support in Colombia. We also have a couple of questions from Dolly Wong for Takashi, because there's a recognition that Japan has, amazing, has done amazing work and knowledge on this, but most of your work is often, obviously, in Japanese, which makes sense. But I was wondering whether a lot of your guidance will one day be available in English or other languages. Thank you.
I will additional answer. I would like to add the answer. Knowledge is piled up, but so I think it's important to understand and convey it in English. So the guide is translated in English, but however, it is not enough now, I think. And it is important to understand the way of thinking behind NBS. So we have a chance if the several sites where we cannot apply Japanese traditional approach. We have a chance to get new approach and new knowledge, I think. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you very much. So I think we have time for one last question. And see who would like to answer this. It's from Azmira, who is interested at knowing a bit more about stakeholder engagement, particularly the role of local communities and faith communities, the role that they could play in implementing ecosystem solutions to mitigate the risk of disasters. So would somebody like to talk on the engagement of different stakeholders? Maybe Hugh?
Yes, absolutely. I'd be happy to take a quick one. I think this is a long-standing issue is the wrong word, a long-standing need that has been in development and climate and DRR policies for many years, and there are obviously good practice, I think, like you say, from Colombia. I think one of the key issues in the Sendai Framework context is around national and local DRR strategies, which is target E. And framework really calls for an all-of-society approach, whole-of-government approach, but implementing that is often challenging. I think resources and knowledge and commitment on how to do that. So really engaging, I think, stakeholders in the development of national DRR strategies to ensure that they then influence local DRR strategies, obviously ensuring nature-based solutions are engaged in that. So really creating the participatory governance mechanisms to allow, I think, communities and different stakeholders to really actively engage, not just in the development of DRR strategies, but also in the implementation and the monitoring. I think accountability of implementing these strategies requires community and stakeholder participation. But specifically on nature-based solutions, this might sound pretty basic, but every ecosystem is different. Every location is different when it comes to their environmental challenges and biodiversity challenges. So the key of engaging, I think, local communities and local knowledge at that level of implementation, I think, is really critical. And again, having those governance structures at local level, and making sure that I think communities are often, compensated for the time, the burden of participation sometimes at the local level. Make sure that the right level of compensation, of incentives, of community-based structures are in place to really make participation worthwhile. So yeah, governance structures that involve local communities.
Great. Thank you very much for that answer.
Also, just to add, Natalie, I just posted on the chat that there are a number of faith for Earth initiatives, faith-based initiatives around environmental issues, and one of them is supported by UNEP. So I've just put a link there, and what I do know is that there are a number of groups working on environment, gender, Indigenous peoples issues in an interlinked manner, for example, and this is a very strong coalition of partners that work on environment issues, but bringing together gender groups and also Indigenous people. So I think definitely these are, depending on the country context and local communities where you work, these will all be relevant, certainly in terms of stakeholder engagement.
Great, thank you, Marisol. Here's an interesting question about, so the person is saying that now every natural resource has human control. So how do we implement a nature-based solution to such human nature resources? And their example they're giving are water bodies behind hydropower reservoirs on rivers. So I don't know whether Sandeep, you would like to have a go at that question.
Yeah, happy to try. I think, this is where referring back to the IUCN definition is actually helpful, because it refers not only to natural ecosystems, but also refers to modified ecosystems. And the reason why it makes that reference quite explicitly is because it recognizes that it's not just now, there have been studies that have even contested, the notion of there ever having been a pristine ecosystem, even historically, even sort of thousands of years back. We imagined the Amazon basin, for example, to be completely untouched, but recent LiDAR radar surveys, for example, unearthed, settlements even under the Amazon forest basin. So the conceptualization of both natural ecosystems and modified ecosystems actually helps to encompass both of those aspects. Thank you.
Great, thank you, Sandeep. So here we have a question from Yves Lador, and it's, does IUCN have specific language requests for the coming new Global Biodiversity Framework to include disaster and climate risks in the principles, targets, or indicators? So maybe Sonia?
Sure, we're working on our most recent position paper, and yes, we will have more explicit text recommendations to include in the negotiations going into the Geneva discussions. Absolutely.
Great.
But more than that, Natalie, we can add that, of course, IUCN together with PEDRR partners and FEBA partners have a policy paper with suggested text for inclusion of reference to disaster and climate risks to be part of the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So we should actually share that policy brief if we haven't done so already on the chat. That would be great. Thanks for the question.
Great. Yes, indeed. In October 2020, PEDRR and FEBA released a first policy brief which was about promoting nature-based solutions. And within that, we have specific text suggestions on some of the targets, which obviously now have been updated already, but nevertheless, it did contain some text. We, moving on this year, obviously have also updated some of our recommendations in terms of for the Global Biodiversity Framework, and I think it is a good time now to present those after this question. So if we could please share the slides, that would be great. Thank you. So we'll be presenting with my kind of colleague who's representing FEBA today, Veronica Ruiz, who's program officer at IUCN. And starting us off for our recommendations, I will pass over to Veronica. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalie, and thank you to the rest of the speakers. It was a really, really insightful discussion today. So today I'm here on behalf of Emily Godwin, my colleague Emily Godwin. She's the coordinator of Defense of the Secretariat for Defense of EBA. So I'm here on her behalf. So as the other speakers have been mentioning, climate change, together with human exploitation and degradation of ecosystem, is causing the widespread loss of biodiversity that we are facing actually, and also the decline in ecosystem functionalities that is leading at the same time to ecosystem collapse and the reduced provision of ecosystem services. So why is that important? Why we are mentioning about promoting coherent implementation of the Rio Convention, which is the first recommendation that we are proposing in the joint paper developed by FEBA and PEDRR. The alignment of the different Rio Convention is critical in order to better address the interrelated challenges of climate change, land degradation, and also biodiversity loss. Sonia, Marisol, Sandeep, and colleagues, they have been mentioning this. This is very important. And why? Just making an example. So by limiting the global average temperature increase to 1.5 above the pre-industrial levels, we can reduce the risk to biodiversity, ecosystem, food system, water, and human livelihoods. So we are really addressing different challenges. Another recommendation that we are putting forward in this document, and this is coming thinking about like the problem that we are facing currently because of the increasing demand for nature-based solutions. This increasing demand has led to cases of whether misuse of misapplication of the concept of nature-based solutions. And even good intentions can result in harm to nature and people. So that's why we are proposing as a second recommendation the use of the IUCN definition for nature-based solutions, as well as the use of the global standard for nature-based solutions, which is based on strong principles and provide robust criteria and indicators. Nevertheless, even though we are recommending this today, neither the IUCN definition nor the global NBS standard have been fully recognized in global policy frameworks across the board, with a few notable exceptions, as Sandeep has been mentioning in his presentation. So this definition is not made from scratch, from zero. This definition was adopted, and Sandeep mentioned as well, and recognized by IUCN and his member back in 2016 at the World Conservation Congress in Hawaii. Similarly, for the global standard, it has been already adopted and recognized by members back in Marseille this last September 2021. So the definition of nature-based solutions primarily relies on the foundation that intervention cannot have negative impact on biodiversity. So this is really important, and that's why with the standard we are proposing a strong biodiversity and human rights safeguards to dismiss any intervention that harm nature and human well-being. And I hand it over to you, Natalie.
Thank you very much. Next slide.
Our third recommendation is about including ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction alongside adaptation in both targets 8 and 11. Target 8 is about threats to biodiversity. And I think there's not been enough recognition, as has been mentioned also by Hugh, of the impact disasters have on biodiversity. One big major example, which happened quite recently, were the wildfires in Australia that were in 2019, 2020, which burned over 97,000 square kilometers of native vegetation and impacted critical habitat for more than 800 native species. And within that, the research has shown that for over 70 species, more than 30% of their range was lost. This is massive, and is meaning that, for many species, they need to update the threat status of some of these species. And what was the cause of these fires? Now, obviously, we know climate change is one of them, but the other was the land use management practices that were in place. So improving the land management practices, which is the basis of ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction, to ensure that fires do not, that reduce the fire proneness of these areas, is something that is crucial. So we really would advocate for including disaster risk reduction to help protect biodiversity. Next slide. Now, as also mentioned by many of the speakers, well-managed ecosystems also are critical for human well-being, and therefore we also advocate for the inclusion of ecosystem-based disaster risk reduction alongside adaptation in Target 11. It's another case study for you, this one also nature conservation related. So this here is showing some images from Yala National Park in southern Sri Lanka, which was hit by the Indian Ocean tsunami in 2004. Now at the top here, you can maybe just make out just a few green rooftops, right, of an eco-tourist resort that was protected by these sand dunes during the tsunami. And meaning that when the tsunami hit this resort, there was only 5 centimeters of water that reached the resort, and there was no casualties. However, at the bottom, you find Yala Safari Resort, which is quite close by to the other ecotourism resort. However, here they had removed the sand dunes for better ocean views, and the result was that there the waves hit the land for over 7 meters and 27 people died. So it really advocates, once again, just adding another example of the real importance for thinking about ecosystems for resilience and improving a resilience for biodiversity itself, but also for human well-being. And finally, next slide, please. We think it would also be really important to monitor the use and contribution of ecosystem-based approaches or nature-based solutions so that we can promote further knowledge and uptake. At the moment, the indicators, none of them really do reflect well ecosystem-based approaches, and we have made some suggestions in our first paper policy brief, which we also put in the link. So this is our final recommendation for moving forwards in the negotiations in the upcoming negotiations. So thank you very much. And I just want to see whether Veronica would like to add anything.
No, I would just add that please go to the link, visit it, and then you can know more about this joint paper between FEBA and PEDRR and all the recommendations that are coming from a very diverse pool of partners. So thank you.
Thank you very much. And to close, I would like to hand back to Marisol Estrella.
Thank you, everyone, for a very interesting panel discussion. So just for, we've really covered a lot of ground here in just an hour. And it's nice to see that people had posted questions and comments on the chat and question box. So, just to maybe I would like to give a chance to our panel members just to give us one key takeaway message from your side based on our discussions today, and I will summarize with a few closing remarks. So let me just start then with our colleague from the Permanent Mission of Japan. Like, what would be our takeaway message to the other permanent missions and our audience today with regards to drafting the new global biodiversity framework?
Yes, thank you very much. So, producing the construction, making local people understanding the policy, and human resource development all linked. The sites all linked. I would like to emphasize, and the sites where knowledge so far cannot be used is opportunity to gain the new knowledge, I think. So we would like to search the new knowledge each other, I think. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And Hugh, may I turn to UNDRR for one key takeaway message from our discussion today.
No, thank you, and a really rich discussion. I think an overarching takeover is that risk needs to be embedded in everything we do as policymakers and as practitioners on the ground. Everything we do needs to take into account: is it reducing existing risk, and is it preventing the creation of new risk, which is really the core of the Sendai Framework. To see that embedded in the biodiversity framework, one real takeaway. And to do that, we need to bring the communities together, which we do around climate action, around biodiversity. That needs to be matched, I think, by the global policy direction, really embedding risk in.
Great, thank you so much, Hugh. And finally, Sandeep from IUCN.
Yeah, thank you, Marisol. For me, I guess the key takeaway would be the need for alignment. Nature out there in the real world is indivisible, but we tend in the human world to siloize it in different processes and conventions and policy frameworks in not always helpful ways. So I think going forward, the greater alignment that we can secure across the different international policy processes and safeguarding nature, which clearly we all agree has these common benefits to provide for biodiversity, for health, for climate change, etc. That alignment, I think, would be really important to ensure an effective and efficient way of addressing the problem. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So I don't really have a lot more to ask. Actually, I had all the points I had was now covered by our panel speakers. What I would actually just then maybe close with and reflect on is that we need to remember that this concept or approach is nothing. It's not new. This has now been recognized, has been widely accepted in other policy agendas. It has been practiced over in countries for many years, in local communities. So this is not a new concept that we are promoting, but we are just trying to align and ensure that our new global biodiversity framework takes into account the emerging risks that we are facing today. And so this is something we should draw from country experiences already. We should draw from the policy agendas that are already in place, and simply then that we can see that the new global biodiversity framework will then have a future forward-looking approach to being able to rise to these challenges that we are facing today, including the climate disaster risks, among others. So I think with that, I would like to really thank all of our organizers and hosts for making this event possible. I'd like to especially thank two people, Natalie, for her efforts in planning and executing this webinar, together with our colleague Veronica from IUCN, and last but not least, of course, Diana from the Geneva Environment Network. And with that, I really wish all of you well. I look forward to seeing the permanent missions here in Geneva, I hope, in March. And for those of you who would like to reach out to us, to PEDRR partners, to FEBA partners, for further information, on this topic, on guidance for the Global Biodiversity Framework. We were more than happy to provide support to permanent missions who have additional questions. So thank you again, and I think I'll close with that, Natalie.
Yes, great. Thank you very much, Marisol, also for summarizing and some final words. And yeah, also echo thank you to all speakers and to the organizers and also the audience. Thank you.
Thank you all. And we look forward to see you at other upcoming events, and you have some here announced on the screen. And as it was mentioned at the beginning of this event, the summary, the video, the links that have been shared in the chat will all be available on the webpage of the event. And as we get closer to the meetings that will take place in Geneva in March, we will be sharing again information and updates on this particular topic.